Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Daiwa Anglo-Japanese Foundation. My name is Jason James, and I'll be chairing this session today about science communication in Japan and the UK, and particularly science and government policy. So there are three people involved today, and so two of us from the UK and one in Tokyo, and I'll just introduce them briefly. So Shigeyuki Koide, who's going to speak first, is a freelance science journalist. He was formerly the senior science editor at the Yomiuri Shimbun, Japan's largest newspaper. And he, as well as working for the Yomiuri for many years, he has done research, been a visiting researcher at Imperial College London on the kind of issues we're going to be talking about today. He's a former president of the Japanese Association of Science and Technology Journalists. And of course, at the moment, he's focusing quite a lot on COVID, like so many of us. And then Professor David Cope, who was formerly director of the UK Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology, has a long history of promoting science collaboration between the UK and Japan. He still has positions at two Japanese universities, Doshisha in Kyoto and the University of Tokyo. He's a fellow of Clare Hall College, Cambridge, and he also was awarded the Order of the Rising Sun in 2012 by the Emperor because of his work in promoting science collaboration between the UK and Japan. So here's the timeline. It's about 20 minutes each from the two speakers, and then we'll move to the Q&A session, which I will chair. And as I say, you can put questions in the chat throughout. So over to you, Shigeyuki Koide.
Okay, thank you very much. I worked newspaper journalist for more than 30 years, and in 2011, after I quit the Yomiuri Shimbun newspaper. I joined the Imperial College London Science Communication Group as a visiting researcher, and because I'm interested in the history of UK science communication after BSE, mad cow disease affair. And I have been interested reporting and researching the Japan and the UK science communication after Fukushima accident. So I'll mention the history of Japanese communication failure at Fukushima accident shortly, and introduce UK governmental chief science advisors approach and consequences to this accident. Additionally, under the pandemic of COVID-19, Japanese headquarters could be slightly recognize the importance of science approach for policy making. So on March 11, 10 years ago, Japan experienced a huge earthquake and tsunami. As a result, the direct result, the Fukushima nuclear power plant, Tokyo Electric Power Company, suffered a serious radiation accident as a result of nuclear fuels meltdown, followed by the hydrogen explosions and a large amount of radioactive particles being scattered widely around the power plant. At the time of the accident, Japanese government, scientific community, and nuclear industry failed to release information promptly to the public. The authorities feared that the release of factual information would result in the widespread social panic. But this communication failure caused serious confusion in Japanese society. Anyways, Fukushima nuclear accident has no radiation fatalities, but the earthquake and the tsunami resulted in 18,000 casualties. The area of contamination around Chernobyl is much greater than the amount of Fukushima. However, the failure of strategically communicating to the public resulted in a serious community-level collapse after the evacuation. Many people lost their houses and properties and jobs, and without prompt public engagement by national or local authorities, some consequently lost their interest and confidence in their life. Fukushima accident is pointed out as technical errors for protecting to the national disaster. However, I think to be characterized to more seriously by the confusion of society. We can see the background of this from the three directions. The first, the government of Japan changed frequently the number of guidelines without any scientific expressions. For example, the food regulations like this. That was the 1,000 becquerels per kilogram meals. That next they changed the 500, and at last the 100 becquerels per kilograms. This is the 1/10 in the international regulations consensus. They were afraid of blaming the public and chose an emotional correspondence. The authorities failed to release factual information about the accident and did not make an announcement for the estimations of this impact. In particular, the Cabinet of Prime Minister, the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, and Nuclear Safety Commissions failed to coordinate their communication efforts during the critical period of emergency response. They instead either kept silent or released limited information difficult to make sense of, or thrust responsibilities upon each other. And so this third one is the Japanese government had an excellent system of predictions, predicting which direction the radioactive particles are spreading. This system was speedy, and this is controlled by the supercomputer, and 90 million pounds to develop it. But they did not release any information from this system during the 12 days after the accident, as they were afraid that it would cause widespread panic. But in other countries, in the meantime, other countries like Norway or Switzerland or Germany, many countries did release the online information quickly and predicting the spread of fallouts every day. They did so with data from Japanese government. But this made severe criticism towards the Japanese administration. The public lost confidence in Japanese scientific community and grew distrustful of science and technology in general. As a result, the misinformed and confused public became unable to think rationally about the broader political, energy, and environmental issues. At that time, some political groups regarded this accident as the best chance to propaganda of anti-nuclear activities. And the mass media, there was a severe controversy with the stance at oppose or at support nuclear energy policy. But finally, the mass media lost their scientific approach and deeply confused to make sure what is factual news or emotional public blame. Then finally, the media also lost their credibility. Discussing nuclear energy was pushed into the bottleneck. It was two political issues, too calmly talking within the public. Consequently, arguments about future nuclear development were reduced to the simple yes or no answers. So then now 62% people answer opposing the nuclear reactor generation. A UK approach to the Fukushima. Comparing the UK and Japan from the point of view of their communication engaging the public, we see that the UK government have released information about Fukushima accident just 4 days after, and announced and announced estimation and the consequences of accident, including the impact of radioactive contamination in the area. The scientific advice included the assessment of the worst case scenario and emphasized that it would be considerably smaller than Chernobyl accident in 1986. Furthermore, Sir John Beddington, the chief scientific advisor of UK government, connected by internet telephone to UK embassy in Tokyo and explained their estimations and predictions. The first conference was held in March in the evening time in Tokyo, and the audiences were embassy staff and key members of UK community in Tokyo. But then the message was rapidly spread to the British and foreign people in Japan. The internet teleconference was replaced 4 times from March 15th to April 7th, connecting the Office of Science in London and UK Embassy in the Tokyo Hanzo Mall. 2 British citizens contributed to share the chief scientific advisor's message for the public. Mr. Paul Atkinson, the first transmitter of the John Beddington's message in English on March 15th, evening at 55 past 6 o'clock p.m. He was the member of the British Chamber of Commerce in Japan and had attended the teleconference at the embassy. And just after the conference, he made the 600 words report and sent up to his Facebook. And Tom Vincent, he's the first translator of the message into Japanese. He also stayed in Tokyo and found Paul Atkinson's message, and he immediately translated it and tweeted on Facebook on March 16th. The same day on 16th, UK Embassy released the transcriptions of conference and also be shared many times. These messages delivered as a credible information for foreigners in Japan. Many European people and Americans wrote that the Beddington's announcement was greatly contributed to cool down the minds of people who were frightened in the lack of information about the accident. But unfortunately, the message was not reached to the Japanese readers because Japanese mass media could not make news articles around this matter because almost all pages and broadcasting programs were occupied by the terrible news from disaster area. A lot of bodies found on the sea coast in Sendai were still rescuing drifting people in the ocean, and explosions Fukushima nuclear reactors. UK announcement: nuclear accident is not so serious matter. Could not have enough power to push out the cruel news. Still now, many Japanese citizens do not know how British scientific advice saved Tokyo from panic. And Professor David Cope and Mr. Jason James were stayed in Tokyo at that time, disaster time, will give you the impressive experiences following after, I suppose. And did Japan change after the Fukushima accident? The message from British Embassy reached to likely same time in Japanese journalists and researchers of science communication. They could make new they could not make news, but Sir John's appropriate effort to communicate to the public strongly impressed Japanese people facing communication, and they thought the difference of science communication appropriate approaches among two countries. This because the trigger of their start to focus on a governmental science communication, and Japanese Science and Technology Agency (JST) or a National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies (GRIPS), and many universities are developing research and promotion. But the member of Diet, a cabinet, and the executive officers were not interested in supposing building the communication system will be so tough in officers' position term, usually the 2 or 3 years. And the Minister of Foreign Affairs is an exception. In 2015, started the first science and technology advisor, Dr. Kishi. But the activity of advisor has not been quite limited because of the indifference of administration. Scientific advice was still out of their bureaucratic manner. And GRIPS started annually open forum focusing science for policy making and started in 2017. The more than 300 progressive young researchers, officers, journalists, and gathered, and whereas there were quite few members from ministries, executives. The next are the International Network for Government Science Advice, INGSA in Gusa held its third conference in November 2018 at GRIPS Tokyo, gathering more than 300 people from over there were very few. But anyway, Professor David Cope also joined the conference from his staying place, a small volcanic island in the center of Atlantic Ocean. This guy's Robinson Crusoe, like this. The COVID-19 pandemic. Fortunately or unfortunately, the COVID-19 pandemic could drill a hole on the surface of bedrock. Before pandemic, the Japanese Prime Minister Abe likely remarks, "I will obediently follow the endorsement of experts, Nuclear Regulation Authority." I wonder, who is the decision maker? Prime Minister or experts? So, if successfully, it is his point, Prime Minister's point. If not, experts' responsibility. The Prime Minister Suga was also on the same stance, but he recently is changing. After COVID Cabinet noticed that the scientific advice should not be avoided. COVID-19 Advisory Committee by scientists established in last year's March. Before then, governmental advisory committees worked as a camouflage for escaping from public criticism and pretend to appeal that judgment treated in the fairness with scientists. But truly, ministers' officers decided in their own convenience. And Dr. Omi, and he is the chief advisory committee on the Japanese government. But the relationship among committee and the cabinet becomes step by step works better than in last year. And Prime Minister uh, Suga, Yoshihide Suga, he's an excellent politician and officer. However, has not been skilled communicator. At his press conference, he did read on staff's article. His attitude seems not willing to communicate to the public. Then the consequences are expressed on the public polls. This approve is overwhelmed by approve. But this is in England, the UK. UK has a bit crucial opinion than Japanese citizens. But anyway, he started to improve this approach to the public concerning science communication. And this month, February 2nd, at a press conference in the cabinet, he introduced first the prompter system for his face up to the audience. Additionally, changing his remark, I will decide and arrange considering the advice of scientists. So in many countries, the many leaders in the world communicate with scientific data or evidence and advice. Also, the cabinet of Japan may think to improve policy making with regard to scientific approach. But the mind is still now that there are still large generation and social gap. Elderly diet members are not trained in the scientific approach, whereas the senior scientists generally dislike hate politics. A gerontocracy, such as former Prime Minister Prime Minister Mori resigned the Japanese Olympic Committee. The gerontocracy is still active, but nevertheless, the young generation seeks another way to communicate to the public. From last September, young diet members with scientific or technology background started the project of meetings with scientists and journalists for seeking how to communicate with each other. Then, I'd like to introduce two famous lockdown professors in UK and Japan. Both studied mathematical epidemiology with Professor Roy Anderson in Imperial College. And despite the ignorance of headquarters in cabinet and ministries, the scientists in Japan began to walk out and gain standing points for the public communicating. Professor Nishiura at the University of Kyoto, the core member of scientist group for COVID advisory committee, had independently announced that 420,000 people will be killed if there is no control to avoid human contacts last year, April. But just after, the Mr. Suga, he is in the cabinet, appeared it is not an official comment of the government. But Professor Nishiura insists that The public should be given the scientific facts and their recognition and the choice of acts. He told, we need the suitable communication framework among scientists, government, and public. And then the movements could have any difficulties, but a little, not a little people in Japan awakened. We need more data and scientific evidence for approaching the decision of government. I hope these strings will join and science communication will be the more popular word in Japanese language. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Koide-san. So, David, straight over to you.
Right, okay, can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine.
Great, okay, well I know quite a few of my friends and colleagues are listening. I can't identify people, obviously, but nice to see you all through this medium. Just a few quick points, responding immediately to Yuki's presentation, which I found really useful, and I learned quite a few things that I wasn't aware of before. Yuki, before anybody else raises it, I think I better say that in your slide, I think it's slide 2, you say that fatalities from radiation because of the incident was 0. I think you have to say immediate fatalities. I mean, it's almost inevitable, I think, that there will be longer-term fatalities, particularly from thyroid cancer. There's a lot of research going on about that. So, as I say, better make that point. It's immediate fatalities. That's another quick sort of follow-up point. In my opinion, the best thing in the UK-Japan interrelationship that went on after Fukushima was this. I don't know if people can see it. Sorry, I haven't got slides. But the report that the Health and Safety Executive produced as early as May by Bill Wakeman, the chief scientist, on the implications for the UK, because I mean that's obviously the major international interest in Fukushima. I'm sorry to say this, there is sympathy for Japan, but people essentially ask the question: could it happen here? And if it did, you know, what will our response be, and what will happen? And I want to touch on that a bit later in my presentation. But as I present, I'd like people to bear in mind a question that I still don't really have the answer for, and that is, what is science communication actually about? What are we talking about here? It's not necessarily scientific advice, although that's part of it. It's the act and process of communication. So please keep that in mind. I'm sure many of you have thought about it already. Now, Jason asked me very quickly, for the benefit of Japanese watchers, people who are participating from Japan, and they're 9:30 at night, aren't you? So thanks for joining. It's quickly about the UK science communication and advice system. Quickly. Well, it all started in 1964. People as old as me will remember Harold Wilson, our Prime Minister, and the white heat of technology. And part of that aspiration, which it certainly was to set up a scientific advice system for the Prime Minister. Since then in Britain, there's been a terrible dilemma as to where science fits in the government system. Should it be a standalone ministry? Should it report directly to the Prime Minister and therefore be part of the Cabinet Office? Should it be attached to the business and industry ministry, because so much, particularly of innovation discussion, is also related to science and technology? Should it be attached to education, because it's seen primarily as research? But until the 1990s, we just had the chief science advisor. But then a series of crises in Britain. Yuki mentioned one of them, the BSE incident. And it became to realize that really we need scientific advice going into each ministry. And bit by bit, that took place. So we now have 24 science advisors for each ministry. One of the most reluctant, I'll tell you this, and I'd be interested to know if the same would be true in Japan, the most reluctant ministries was the Treasury. So is MOFA similarly reluctant to take on board science advice? The people appointed to this role have very often, more often than not, had a medical or public health background. That is the chief science advisor. It's interesting that John Beddington, who we'll talk about, and we'll talk about a bit more in a minute, was not a medic. His specialization actually is fisheries ecology. There's also an advisory group called the Committee on Science and Technology, a bit similar to the Science Council of Japan in a way, 21 members. It's a bit obscure, to be honest. Of course, the Chief Science Advisor also is in charge of our government office, not a ministry, office of science. That's how the government side works. Just another point I'd make, relating to the COVID situation, it's been very interesting to me that there's been much more use made of, well, both the Chief Medical Officer, Whitty, as you know, and the Chief Science Advisor, Balance, in media appearances. Now, since Howard Wilson's time, I mean, there have been media appearances. I remember appearances of David King around the time of the foot and mouth epidemic, but much more use has been made in this COVID situation of direct media appearances. Just very quickly, because Jason raised it, there's also alongside the government function, which I just outlined in this case, a parliamentary function. And this is true not only of Britain, but of about 13 or 14 countries around Europe and the USA. And you've got to remember the role of parliaments is to scrutinise government policy. And so the special advice is given by those organisations to Parliament in its role of asking the right questions about government. Now, coming back to the question I raised, science communication. Communication to who? It seems to me that there are two critical differences, two complementary but distinct elements here. One is obviously communication to policymakers, and the other one is communication to the public, and they interact, obviously. However, I think the most distinctive and important criterion when we look at science communication is what is being communicated recommendations, actual statements. You should do this. You're advised to do this. Or is it what we would call options or possibilities? It's interesting that quite a few of the officers reporting to Parliament, or these two, across Europe, they actually have options in their title. In other words, they don't make recommendations, neither did my office at Parliament, but they try and set out as comprehensive a range of options and the scenarios that are linked to those options to be used by the policymakers, or indeed by the general public, if they so wish. Now, I mean, a feature of both Fukushima Daiichi and COVID, though they are very, very different, is, of course, they are emergencies. A lot of science and technology advice is not in terms of innovation, where you research priorities over the longer term. And emergencies obviously means that you're dealing with a time scale of a few days in the case of Fukushima to, should we say, a few months in the case of COVID. So there is a real issue in how you actually organise advice in real time. I mean, to draw on one example, my own experience at Parliament, some years ago in Britain, an oil tanker went aground off the coast of Wales, and not surprisingly, Welsh MPs were extremely concerned about pollution from that and the impact that they'd heard about of anti-pollution measures. And they asked the Office of Parliament, what can be done? What are the consequences? And we had a week to produce advice and to try and identify all the options to mitigate the impact of oil pollution on coasts. And believe you me, it's quite a challenge to try and get advice orchestrated in that space of time. Some other points I'd like to make. Whenever you're communicating, and certainly if you're involved in presenting advice or options, you have to recognize, obviously, that there are special interests involved. The people who are receiving your advice divide into a certain number of groups, and they have different perspectives on the issue. One of the ones which fascinates me, and this arises in certainly Fukushima Daiichi, less so really with COVID, is geographical interests. You know, are you an immediate threat from a fallout crowd, or do you not really have to worry about it? And we find that, for example, in the issues of Fukushima Daiichi, about disposal of wastes. You know, wastes from the power plant have been collected, both solid and, of course, water in particular. And then how are they going to be disposed of? Then there are economic interests, of course, these are hugely powerful. And in the case of Fukushima Daiichi, you have, for example, fisheries, agriculture. How do you communicate to people who have those very strong economic or geographical interests? I won't say anything about media coverage, because apart from this dialogue's got another thing coming up. Except one thing, I'm very interested in terms of international coverage about, but actually zero discussion about what happened not at Fukushima Daiichi, but at another nuclear power plant further north, closer to the epicenter, called Onagawa, where basically nothing. And paradoxically, the plant sports hall was used as a shelter for people from the town who had lost their homes, because Onagawa town was very, very badly impacted by the tsunami. Some other points, just to pick up. Yes, I did experience it was 10 days that shook the world, literally, because it really started not on the 11th, but on the 8th, because there was what turned out to be foreshock, quite a foreshock. It first indicated that something was going on. Yes, I experienced the power cuts. I monitored what was going on. Call me a nerd. Wherever I travel, I always take my Geiger counter with me, mainly to see what the dose is on the aeroplane. But I could monitor what was going on, and it was clear that there was particularly on Tuesday afterwards a cloud, a radiation cloud that came down over central Tokyo. But I won't say any more about that. But some participants might be interested in that. And then to pick up immediately, because I had it in my notes here, a point that one participant has already raised, my good friend David Alexander from IRDR UCL. Hi. What were the growth of online interactions? I mean, we're seeing it incredibly with COVID. And I think it is going to have a very, very profound impact on the whole nature of science communication. Something that I think scientists have not really yet got their heads around and got to grips with. So I think those are the main. Oh, just one point, another point to Yuki, because he has been very complimentary about the British system. I don't know, Yuki, if the same thing had it couldn't happen in Britain because we don't have the same setup. I mean, there's nowhere we've got the same density of reactors at Fukushima Daiichi. But suppose I don't know something had happened at Sizewell. I don't know if we'd have done any better. I don't know. I mean, you talked about widespread panic and the concern about avoiding that. It's very complimentary that you think the British system handled it better, but I'm still prepared to have some considerable doubts about that. But let's perhaps cover some of those in the discussion, because I know there's some people who are listening in who probably have more direct knowledge about that than I do. So hope you kept the time, Jason, and let's get into the discussion as soon as we can.
But for today, I will wrap it up. So thank you very much to both Koide-san and David for your contributions today. And I hope we'll see you all again shortly, maybe tomorrow.